Okay, welcome everyone and welcome Craig Weller and Jonathan Pope to the show. Hi guys, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Where are you guys joining us from?
So I'm in the mountains outside of Denver, Colorado.
And Jonathan, whereabouts?
Yeah, and I'm normally in Denver, but I'm traveling right now. So I'm actually in Bellingham, Washington.
Avid skiers, nice. Both of you as well too. Jonathan, I see that you are an avid skier, or is it snowboarder?
Both. Yeah, I do a lot of backcountry skiing as much as I possibly can each year. I like a lot of ski mountaineering. So I've actually been able to do that all over the world at this point. Actually, Australia is the only, or Oceania is the only continent I have not skied on currently.
Well, apparently you're not missing that much. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, some of the nice things about Australia is that, you can stay on the mountain and especially down, I think, in Falls Creek, which is really cool. And it's not bad. Kosciuszko, certainly we don't have the same, I think, conditions, obviously, as what you do in North America and through Europe. New Zealand's not bad to ski, but you can't stay on the slopes there. But yeah.
All right, guys. Well, how about we start off with just a little bit of a background on the both of you, how you got started, how you guys got connected, and we'll go from there.
Sure, yeah. So my background is not at all like the normal academic or business pathway. I came from the special operations world and kind of took the long way. I grew up in a tiny town in South Dakota in the middle, like flatland part of the US, like basically grew up in a cattle pasture, and didn't know how to swim because swimming pools weren't really a thing where I grew up. But when I was 17, I finished high school and enlisted in the Navy and volunteered for a special ops unit and learned how to swim while I was in the pipeline for the selection for that unit. So I learned by taking the initial screen test, failing it fast enough to get sent to stroke development and getting a swimming lesson, and then coming back and doing it again. And I passed on my last try by a couple of seconds. I just squeaked under the line and then struggled my way through the selection pipeline the rest of the time, and eventually graduated after 2.5 years of basically near drownings. And partway through that, after failing my selection course, failing a swim about 2 weeks from graduation, getting sent to a development program, I was a SWCC student, which is Special Warfare Combatant Crewman. I got rolled into the BUDS pipeline, which is SEAL training. And it was there that I had real performance coaching for the first time. And instead of just try harder, just put out more, just work harder, get your heart stronger, I had a guy who watched me swim and gave me specific things to do better. Like bend your arm like this, roll your torso like this. And it was measurable, knowable, testable things. And he'd stand at the end of the lap lane and tap me on the top of the head and tell me if I was doing them wrong. So I had a clear mental model and a feedback loop. And I improved more in a month of doing that. I was there for 4 months total than I had in the first year and a half. And while I was in that pipeline, I saw literally thousands of people fail or quit along the way. And pretty much every single one of them was a better athlete and a better swimmer than I was. And so when you think about the special operations world, you think of like physical toughness and fitness. But if you look at the stats, physical fitness is only mildly predictive of success. So if you go into these courses with the top, you're in the top 95%, like the top 5% of the screen test, your odds of success are the highest if you're in the top 5% of your course, but you still only have about a 1 in 3 chance just based on that information. So beyond that, everything else is based on mental and emotional factors. And I became really interested in that. Like my courses, on average, about 80% of the people who started washed out. And I made it through somehow, even though I couldn't really swim the whole time. So I became really interested in why that was and what it was that allowed someone to have these mental and emotional characteristics to make it through a really terrible thing. And I started studying that. And then once I was active as a special operator, I started coaching other people, did that for 6 years, got out and did some contract work. And then a ways after that, I started my first gym and then met John, and we started another one called, at the time, Rogue Performance, now Ethos Colorado, which became what we do with Building the Elite. And we started testing and developing these ideas that from that point on, we kind of built together, but were based on those initial experiences of, it's not just being good at push-ups and swimming and pull-ups that gets you through a really difficult thing. It's also what's inside your head. And we started looking at the whole person and how to take that picture apart, find the limiting factors, and put it back together.
Wow, there's so much I'd like to unpack there, but I feel if we do that, we probably won't get a bit of an understanding of Jonathan, your background. So maybe we do that first, and then we might come back and maybe unpack some of what you've even said there, because I've got some questions already. So, Jonathan, what's your background? And sort of what's led you to where you are right now?
Yeah, my background is definitely the more traditional route. I was a college athlete. And during that time, I got beat up badly. So really quickly, I realized during college that what I was doing wasn't working. So over the course of like 5 years, I had as many surgeries and washed out of college sports really quickly. And I was always the guy who would show up early. And I remember specifically my freshman year of college, I'd go to the training room like an hour and a half before practice started to do this like extremely elaborate protocol of all kinds of crazy stuff to try to fix my elbow and my shoulder that were giving me chronic issues. And then I'd go to practice, do that for 3 hours and come back. And then I'd do another set of protocols and then finish it off with like numbing my entire body with ice. And so it'd be like 5 or 6 hours every day. It was insane. And by the end of my freshman year, I was worse off. I ended up having to have my elbow reconstructed. And, I thought the way forward was to get to the bottom of this. So I'm going to study, I'm going to do pre-med, I'm going to go to med school because more education is better. And the more specialized, the better, right? So I continued on with my college and I worked with everybody who would listen to me and would let me learn from them. So I was doing my pre-med undergrad. I studied exercise science. I also did a minor in nutrition. I would do internships with anyone who would have me. And finally, I found somebody who was doing their PhD in biomechanics, and he had previously been a strength coach, but he had this very diverse background where he had been a strength conditioning coach. He understood nutrition really well. He understood exercise physiology. He had worked with physical therapists. So he had all this diverse knowledge, and he combined all of it to be by far and away the most effective person I'd ever been around. It was actually all the PTs, athletic trainers, and the MDs for the college would send him their trouble cases, like people that couldn't figure out how to make better. And then he would work with them and then, put them through a series of tests. But really what he did was he understood the complexity of the human body and performance, and that there were going to be a diverse set of things factoring into that person's performance. Whereas like the MD could only see things from their specific lens of knowledge. And while they had a really, really deep set, a lot of education, it was in a very, very narrow path. And the same with the nutritionist or a PT or whoever it may be, or a strength coach. And instead of that, he had this really diverse set of tools. And so that basically convinced me that I was on the right path. I'd continue on and go to med school. But instead, I needed to learn from as many different fields as possible and try to combine all those fields in a way where I could actually help people like myself who were really stuck, where effort wasn't the limiting factor, where I was showing up every day and doing everything everybody told me, but it didn't work out. And so over time, I began to understand kind of why I was at, how to be a much more effective coach. And that's what eventually led me to Craig. Craig had a much different background than myself, obviously, but we seem to have like a similar philosophy. And so when he moved to Denver, I reached out to him and we connected. We really well, and then we just started working together. And then again, kind of combine our backgrounds, different areas of expertise, continuing on that kind of obsessive quest over the past decade. That's where we eventually founded BTE and trained all the guys who train, and that's how we're here today.
Great. Hey, Jonathan, just really quickly, what was the sport that you were playing? Because I didn't quite catch that.
I played baseball.
Oh, baseball. Okay. What, were you a pitcher? Is that why your elbow was wrong, or is it?
Yeah, a little bit of everything. I pitched. I also played on the infield. I could throw. Yeah, I could throw really hard. That's my primary skill was I could throw really, really fast. But that meant I was really good early in life, and probably like other places, but definitely in America, if you're really good at a sport at a young age, then you end up doing that thing excessively. So I was playing like over 100 games a year when I was 12 years old.
Wow!
Because anyone and everyone, wanted you to be on their team, and winning was the premium. That was the goal. It wasn't longevity.
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah, it's funny. And so in hindsight, Jonathan, if you could go back and talk to your younger self, if you were coaching your younger self, would you back off on the frequency of how often you were playing, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, you know, like I don't know if I would be the person I am today in the place I am today if I hadn't gone through those challenges, because they shaped a lot of the path that I'm on today, which, you know, there's a lot of pain there, but that's how you grow, right? And my reaction to those things was I think in the long run very positive, and I'm happy that I'm where I'm at today. So I don't know if I would change it, but you obviously don't want other people to go on that path. So
yeah, the benefit of hindsight, right?
To other people, I would not have them do what I did. No, it's not the best path. Just knowing the numbers that we know, like if you're that great of an athlete, you're going to find a way to get to that level anyways. And while specialization might work for a certain percentage of people, it does not work for the overwhelming majority of people. And most really high level athletes are great at a bunch of things and specialize later in life. And it tends to be a little bit easier on your body.
Oh man. I mean, and the funny thing is, and Craig, I'm going to come back and talk to you in a second about just a little bit of the stuff that you were mentioning in your bio. But one of the big things, Jonathan, that I found as well too, is I was a talented athlete when I was younger, probably not to the same level as you, but when I was growing up, the amount of regret that I lived with, that I hadn't done things differently, that I hadn't, I got a really bad knee injury, ended up getting my knee dislocated 180 degrees effectively from where it should be. It was terrible in my senior year in grade 12. And that kind of stopped any sport that I was going to be playing. And for years, I'd think back in that. And then I actually got on a really bad track straight out of school. My parents went back to New Zealand. I stayed here. I was 18. And sport was such a huge part of my life. And because I literally had a cast on my leg, and then I had a brace for, I think, 4 months. And then my rehab was really terrible. And I thought it was all over. I started drinking. And this actually sort of is true. That epiphany, I then wasted a lot of my late teens, early 20s, just, not just wallowing in a bit of sorrow really in terms of, what I'd lost and became directionless. But it's true. It's what you learn through that, and through that adversity. Regret is such a useless emotion that you can't go back and change it. You've got to learn, well, what have I learned out of it and how can I use that? But that's interesting. When I said, what would you do? And you're like, well, actually it made me the person I am today. That's pretty interesting sort of mindset. And again, you hear a lot of people that have been very successful do that, because it's the people that look back with regret and, I could have been, I should have been, this is unfair. They seem to get stuck in that point and they never progress, right? So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, but, setbacks and failures, how you think of those things make a big difference in the trajectory of your life, and they're inevitable. You can't avoid them. So if you see them as your friend and a way of improving over time, obviously unnecessary setbacks aren't helpful, but like you said, they're unavoidable. So when they do happen, if you can use them to your benefit, then you're going to live a much better life in general. Yeah.
That's awesome. And look, one more thing, and then I'm going to sort of, we'll get into a little bit more of the minutiae of what you guys are doing now. But Craig, you said that, with regards to talent not being the important or the most critical factor as far as actually becoming successful. If there was one thing one characteristic, one attribute as far as actually becoming successful, achieving, whatever goal it is, or making it, if you like, what would be that one attribute that you think that people need to actually succeed?
Realistically, I think a growth mindset, which is at this point kind of a cliche thing to say, but if you don't internalize the idea that struggles and setbacks or effort are a necessary part of a process of learning to do anything worthwhile, or that learning is inherent to doing something worthwhile, then you're going to get stuck pretty fast. Even if you start out with a lot of initial talent, like life is going to give you a setback. And if you aren't capable of accepting negative feedback and acting on it and improving and learning and struggling your way through and recognizing the value of that struggle, then eventually you're just going to get stuck at whatever arbitrary chance put you at. And that's where we see a lot of guys end up with the special operations stuff, and that's one of the reasons that really good athletes often don't make it, because they're not, the programs are designed to break them in some way. They're designed to level everyone out and give everyone the worst day of their life in some way. So if you're a really good athlete and running and doing swimming, doing all this stuff come really naturally to you, and you've always had positive feedback and you've always been good at it, then one day you're in this environment where it doesn't matter. And no matter how fast you run or how many push-ups you can do, you're still going to get kicked in the face. Like a lot of guys haven't internalized the mechanisms for coping with that ambiguity and struggle. And even though they have the raw material physically, they have all the potential of a good athlete, they don't mentally have those coping skills that other people may have developed a lot earlier in life because they weren't good at things. So there's this paradox where in the special ops programs, first, what is valued is not generally being really good at something. Like if you finish first in a run, no one really cares. Like it's kind of cool, but you're also just doing something that you're good at, and no one's here to be a track athlete. And secondly, the thing that is valued the most is the guys that they call it put out, the guys that put out the most effort relative to their abilities. So the guys that dig into their soul to finish, even if they're like one of the last guys crossing the line. And so you see this thing where a lot of the really great athletes drop out and quit because they can't mentally handle it when the goalposts keep moving. And then like the farm kids that are just used to suffering and struggling and were never great athletes struggle their way through the entire course and they keep going. And it's a lot of the people who just learned how to struggle or learned how to suffer and take that in stride that are ultimately successful.
Yeah, I can't remember who I heard. I mean, obviously, I think that's pretty much well spot on as far as one of the ingredients and recipes for success. And I guess it depends what you focus on. I heard somebody else say something else as well too. I think it was grit, which kind of is sort of the similar way of what you're saying as well too, that ability to be able to push through regardless of the adversity, regardless of the setbacks, and just keep going. And I think that's right. Where you've got talented athletes that are particularly used to winning all the time, particularly used to a measure of success that, if you like, was inherent or was expected and came easily. As soon as that ease is taken away, you really get to see how much resilience that they have. And I think that's, whether it's in business, whether it's in sport, whether it's in life, you see people give up. I mean, I'm sure, in the field of battle as well too, you'll see people, give up or feel overwhelmed, and pretty much will then, and again, I don't want to talk in an area of expertise that you're in, Craig, but I can imagine that probably greatly reduces this, their percentage or their chance to stay alive or to be effective. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's in the case of the special ops stuff, that's what they're selecting for. Because, like that world is designed to be really difficult. So they're selecting for people where the push-ups and the running and the swimming are all arbitrary. Like you're never going to have a push-up battle. But they're selecting for people who are good at staying on target and moving forward in the face of really strong opposition or against really terrible odds. So it's a way of using physical things to assess mental and emotional capacities, like your capacity for, in a sense, goal fixedness or adaptability, the combination of the two, and your ability to suffer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, already, like what we've been discussing, I can see how it's going to flow into business as well. But tell us a little bit about building the elite. So that, I mean, I suppose you've kind of already both gone over it a little bit. It's like the focus there is the special ops, really, isn't it? But you're obviously expanding into business. So can you tell us a bit about the program, what it entails, and let's then jump straight into the business stuff, because I think that's, we can already see the relatives, right? Like it's.
I mean, just naturally, I learned so much from listening to athletes and other high end individuals that have become at the peak of their craft, because there's always something that we say AAA it, which is adopt, adapt, apply. In certain circumstances, as you say, like you can look at somebody who's an athlete, and as you said before, Jonathan, you're having to train at peak levels. Mentally, you've got to be prepared. You've got to focus. I mean, I love that movie with Kevin Costner where he's sitting there. I try to do this with my son because he's a rep basketball player. And he was missing all of his free throws. And I was asking, I was saying, well, what's going on? And when we got down to it, he was actually just being distracted and he didn't have the same set mechanism. Like you watch basketballers in the NBA, they have the same setup every single time. And I don't know if you've seen that movie with Kevin Costner where he says, clear the mechanism. Have you guys seen that? I think it's called For the Love of the Game. It's where he goes out and he pitches.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great film. It's an oldie, right? But he actually pitches, I think, if you haven't seen, actually, I won't tell you, but it's actually go and watch it especially if you love sports films. But there's so much in that, and he clears the mechanism each time because like they're yelling at him and they're calling him, all the rest of it, and he's just like all that then just zones out, and he's just focused on this one thing. But again, you can take that from any sport and relate it to business, to life, to any pursuit, anything that's really important. You can actually learn from those people that are really elite. So, obviously this is what you guys are doing. You're taking your expertise and your experience in terms of these different fields and then applying that to business. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And what you'll find, I've actually sent you guys a couple of copies of the book at some point, but what you'll find with a lot of the principles that we use is that they broadly apply well beyond high performance in the special operations world. They apply to anyone who's trying to learn quickly, be adaptable, and perform sustainably at a high level without burning out. So there's been a pretty natural parallel where smarter people in general in various industries have recognized that and have found our book for that. And we started working with some of them, applying these same concepts or principles in just different settings, but ultimately they're the same skills or the same mental models that are being used.
I love stories, Craig. I don't know if you could potentially relate maybe some of the business people that you've worked with, or maybe some things that you could maybe highlight where there was an aha moment.
Yeah, I'm trying not to reveal like specific names.
No,
We're working with someone in the call it a sales industry, where they had a large team, and everyone, the way their business model was set up was it's commission based. It's a very sort of ruthless, difficult environment at first, where your first couple of years, you're basically just suffering your way through on a tiny paycheck. And if you stick it out and continue, the revenue becomes really good. The personal incomes become very good. But it requires a lot of sacrifice basically up front, meaning time on working evenings, on weekends. Because of the sales role, they have to catch people like all over the place. So they're missing their families, they're missing birthdays, they're doing a lot of stuff like that. And it takes a big toll. And we looked at a couple of things in their organization and the role of things like social support, family support. And that there's a strong parallel there. Like this is the sales industry, but there's a strong parallel there to how special ops units function, because it's kind of the same thing where we're traveling constantly. You're always out at training. Like I lived technically in San Diego for 4 years, and I totaled it up and I spent like 11 months there or something, because the rest of the time I was training or deploying. And so we broke down for them in that case. That was one of the limiting factors that kind of broke people or washed them out of the industry. So we just broke down some specific skills or practices that would help them manage that. And we used an example of what John does with his girlfriend, Anna, where because of their, like, as you can see, he's traveling, like because of both of their interests and hobbies, they don't have a lot of shared time together. So they emphasize the quality of their time. And they have things like they have specific times on their calendars where they're together and there's nothing else that matters or nothing else that they do. And they put their phones in phone jail and they, focus on spending time together, and they value their relationships, and they have specific processes in place where they emphasize the quality of the time that they spend together because the quantity of it is limited. So we walk through some things like that we use with special ops guys where they have similar conditions, and we just taught these Salesforce people to apply the similar ideas and to also learn how to better lean on the social networks and social support within their own teams, which is another one that's really big in the soft communities. The people, like the guys you're working with, the people you're working with, you eat, you work out, you sleep in the same rooms, like you're never away from them, and you learn to be really dependent on one another. Like you back each other up on everything kind of reflexively. And And a more effective corporate team kind of does the same thing, where everyone knows a little bit about everyone's jobs. Everyone can kind of fill and flow as needed. And even though their commissions are somewhat independent, they still have the ability to support one another and kind of grow the company as a whole. And that was one of the things that we emphasized with them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Actually, that's always interesting. The individual versus the team reward. I think if you look after the individuals, but if the individuals have a team mentality, then like with our sales team as well too, when one goes away on holidays, the rest, and sometimes even the marketing team and actually get in and support. So you've got an integrated team that genuinely cares about each other, and then that brings the results. It's, again, one of my favorite quotes is, and I say it virtually every podcast, so people get sick of it, but it's so true, which is Zig Ziglar. If you help people to get where they want to go in life, you naturally, also get to where you want to go, right? It's about helping people. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jonathan, you're muted.
All right, got it. Another important piece that we talk with them a lot that I think resonates with a lot of people is this idea of feedback loops. So they're going into a business with a really steep learning curve, right? And so their ability to be successful is going to be their ability to iterate and to be able to learn really, really rapidly, because they're going to have call after call after call, and they're going to fail and fail and fail and fail. And so they're going to fail a lot more than they're going to succeed, especially initially. So there's like a couple of things that are really important with that. So the first thing with their feedback loop would be never to get to this point called satisficing, where you just get good enough, right? Where you automate your skills at some point and then figure that it's just a matter of repetitions to be successful. And the really successful salespeople, the people who make it, never do that. Instead, they're constantly getting feedback and changing their approach. And the kind of another important part of that is this idea of bounded rationality. In other words, you always have like a limited perspective. You only have your knowledge and your set of experiences in life. And so somebody can tell you a set of words to do something like a different strategy, a different sales strategy on the call, but you can only see that thing from your perspective. And so you have to be able to take a step back and get feedback from your mentors and the people around them, specifically in the sales organization, and to accept that feedback and to not just want the feedback, but to really dive in and ask for it and be willing to take that thing and not to say, yeah, I know. Because the quality of these people's feedback loops, so in other words, how willing they are to not be right, and then their willingness to continue to adapt and not just lean on the things that they know are working for them, is going to really dictate their path over time. And the other thing is investing in loss. So you're going to feel like an idiot. Your sales pitch might even get worse in the short term by trying a new strategy, right? Because you initially build a set of skills and you're starting to maybe get further along in a phone call than you previously did, but you're still not getting the sale. You're not closing the deal. Well, you might have to invest in short-term loss, where now you feel uncomfortable. You can't be as effective in the short term, but in the long run, that leads to these really effective feedback loops where you can continue to learn. And this is true at like every scale in the business, right? Like if I'm the entry-level salesperson, it's very obvious they need that thing. But even if the regional manager doesn't want to listen to the people directly below them, then they're going to stop learning. And the world is constantly evolving. And if you don't have this feedback mechanism at every level of your company, where you're actually listening to people who have different things to say than what you are currently saying or you might want to hear, and you're not taking a second to take a step back, realize that your perspective is limited and that maybe you should consider where they're coming from, because they might actually know something that you don't know, regardless of their position in the company, then your feedback loops are going to get stagnant, and over time you'll be less and less successful. And so the people in sales are kind of the ultimate thing here, where it's very obvious. If you're good at what you do, you sell more stuff. And so there's no bullshit, right? And there's a lot of other companies where leadership positions or management type positions can kind of hide behind other people. If you're not directly on the sales side thing, you don't have to live in these feedback loops, and you can actually get worse at your job over time. And so it's especially important, but it's directly applicable kind of regardless of the place you're at in a business. But sales being one of those that always highlights your actual competence, and you just can't hide behind any other kind of mechanism or your rank or anything else.
Wow. I mean, Yeah, there's four really big points in there. I think, a sharp knife becomes dull if it keeps doing the same thing with actually some friction and some sharpening. Like, if you're doing the same thing all the time, business by the numbers is something that a lot of businesses actually run by, and it's sort of like a code. Some will, some won't. So what next? But you do the same thing, and that 5.3% of out of 100 people, will do it. So it's just a numbers game, right? You see this a lot with a lot of organizations. You're actually saying, no, don't accept the status quo. Actually become adaptive and if you like, reactive to determine how you can actually become meaningful, and solving solutions or problems or whatever it may be. I mean, it could be your tone, it could be your timing. I mean, obviously there's lots of things there. Sorry, Jonathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, so you're exactly right. So say you know that 5.3% of people will convert if you just keep running the same ad set and this and this and this. Well, great, but eventually that's probably not going to be true. And so you can accept maybe a short-term drop-off in that percentage to experiment and try new things that might open an avenue to a much higher percentage conversion because you've actually done something new and novel and figured out and continue to evolve. So you can kind of continue to do the same old thing and exploit that far as you possibly can. So it's this concept of exploit versus explore. So explore inherently requires you to invest resources. And sometimes that leads to a short term, not as much of a gain, but you don't get stuck on a plateau of performance where you no longer gain, right? So instead, you're kind of exploring a new valley, and along that path, you can therefore eventually reach a higher plateau and a higher level of performance. But that requires the ability to take a step back and be okay, again, novel insights and trying new things and failing, essentially, and learning from those mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, humility plays a big part in that. And that's really hard. You're talking about sales team as well too, especially where you've got subordinates that might be able to bring you something new. I mean, you're saying as well too, the cheese has moved. I mean, if you've read that book, but it's the whole world's been turned upside down with COVID in the last couple of years in terms of the way that business is done. Some businesses are thriving, some businesses are struggling. It's a rising tide for some. It's a rip tide for others. So the ability to be able to adapt and adopt and actually, be prepared to stand back. I think Japanese, I can't remember the term and I can't remember exactly where I heard this, but I think the Japanese have a phrase where sometimes you've got to go slower so that in the future you can go faster. So you've got to take that time, evaluate, learn, and then forge ahead. If you're constantly sort of running at that bleeding edge of capacity and you're not taking a step back and evaluating, then there's no room for improvement. You're just constantly just doing and not actually adapting or thinking and potentially improving. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, in the training world, that would be like performing versus training, right? So, like if you're always just performing, you're always just trying to be right at the edge of what you can currently do, then you're never going to be building an underlying capacity to again reach that higher level of competency. So you have to have a mix, right? Like most traditional businesses can't they're not the Googles of the world where they can spend an unbelievable amount of money on just trial and error and big crazy things, right? But if you invest nothing on that front and you're always just trying to kind of maintain the status quo, then you're unlikely to ever have much of a growth.
Yeah. Well, I always think of like those companies like Kodak and that, like
Blockbuster.
Yeah. Blockbuster. I heard something the other day, and again, I can't verify this is true, but I heard it's a good story, but I heard that Netflix went to Blockbuster and apparently Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy them for $50 million. Have you guys heard that story?
I think I've heard that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's
look this up now.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Now, I mean, it could be feasible, and obviously things like that happen all the time. But this is the thing about paradigms and things that are shifting. And I always consider success to a point, not necessarily being specifically, it's this exact point over here. Sometimes I look at it in terms of. And you've got to get the sort of the feel of what I'm saying here, because I appreciate sometimes you want to set your vision on a goal and you'll accept nothing else except for obviously achieving that. But I look at success almost like a circle, and then you're the dot in the middle of the circle. And there's many the success might change because as you're going, you get a roadblock. Like for example, a life-changing injury, COVID, your business fails, whatever it may be, but that doesn't define you in terms of becoming successful or achieving what it is that you're trying to achieve. It just means that there's another pathway, and it may even take you down somewhere. You might be going due north, but at the end you might find success, east or west or southwest. And if you allow, I guess, the experiences that you have to be able to shape you, and it's the difference between being tunnel visioned and being adaptable. And I guess that's the balance where you've got to not flip and flop from things, but I think
more agile.
Yeah, you've got to be agile, and you've got to be prepared to accept and sort of reevaluate and go, am I still on the best path? Do I need to make an adjustment here?
Yeah, like the word resilient or resiliency is a big buzzword now, but it's also kind of an outcome. Like you can't just tell yourself to be resilient. What it really means in practice for the most part is to be adaptable. And people who are adaptable are resilient. And that's more the input that drives that behavior. I didn't pick up if you actually surfed or not, or if you're just familiar with really cold water, but there's a thing in surfing.
That's what I tell my wife.
Called a cleanup set.
The water's really cold.
Wave.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. So there's a cleanup wave or a cleanup set that comes in, and you're all in kind of a line out in the water, letting the waves roll by. And there's a certain point where they all kind of break within this little area. And once in a while, there's one that will come from way further outside that's much bigger, that breaks way further out in the ocean. And if you're not paying attention, it's going to break well before the point where everyone's hanging out. And it's called a cleanup set because it cleans everyone off of the waves or back to the beach. Right. And so when you're surfing, most of the time you kind of pay attention to right where the waves are breaking. You're trying to catch one right there. And the few people who survive the cleanup set or the cleanup waves are the ones who have an eye to the horizon and are able to quickly recognize and respond to the cleanup sets that are building outside, because you have to turn and paddle out to sea really fast when you see it in order to get over it or hopefully catch it before it breaks. And everyone else who's not paying attention to the stuff that's developing on the outside gets caught unaware and gets washed away. Where, the more adaptable people, the ones who are able to recognize things that are happening in the future, things are coming from the outside, are able to dodge the problem or even ride it and, adapt and succeed in it. Like, it's a great feeling if you're the one that's still there when everyone else just got washed to the beach. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about the pandemic that's rolled through as kind of a similar thing. Like, there are people who saw what was happening, were able to see how this is going to change the future. Mm-hmm. And it's going to have a lot of implications for business models, for the way people work, for the way people consume things. And rather than arguing its reality and being mad about it and not wanting it to change, they adapted and responded as quickly as they could to the new reality that was coming to them. And those people have become really successful in the pandemic. Anyone who adapted to virtual environments, things like that, or anyone who doubled down on a business model that wouldn't survive this new thing coming, kind of got washed away.
Yeah, and again, we talk about blockbuster. We talk about people that stay in their lane and then don't consider that reset moment. But you're right, and there's a lot of anger around COVID, and there's a lot of stuff being said. But strip back all of that, in terms of right, wrong, handled correctly, where it came from, all of that, right? I mean, there's so much, and that's realistically that is just noise, because a lot of that stuff that you're talking about, getting angry about. You can't control any of that. All that you can control is, okay, so here comes this massive wave. What do I do now? Have I positioned? And if I haven't, all right, what do I do? What do I do?
Yeah.
What do I do? Do I duck dive? Do I go with it? Do I hold on? What do I do? Right. So that ability to access reality and go, okay, it's maybe not the best situation, but it's always my move next. Right. What do I do? One of the things I wanted to pick really quickly is the hypothesis of PAR. And I think we kind of touched a little bit on that before. And again, sort of like going through the numbers and all the rest of it. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So there's a saying that a lot of people don't have 10 years of experience in an industry or in their field. They have 1 year of experience that they've repeated 10 times. So when you look at skill acquisition or stages of learning, there are 3 stages. The first is the cognitive stage, where you're just kind of learning the mental model, the picture of what good is, And then there's the associative stage where you're practicing, you're learning what it feels like. You're starting to develop pattern recognition and get a feel for it. And there's the autonomous stage, which is the third final stage where it's automated and you've decided that that skill is good enough and you just run with it. Like typing, for example. At some point you learned how to type and you had to learn what the buttons did. And it was like at first a very mental cognitive model. And then at some point you started typing faster. You were able to widen your focus. You're able to think in like chunks of words rather than letter by letter. And then at some point, and you never really thought about it, you just stopped thinking about typing. And whatever level you were at when you stopped thinking about it is the level at which you stopped improving. And that was probably when you were like 12. And you haven't gotten better since then. The same thing happens when you drive a car. Like at first you get your driver's license and you're learning a lot of stuff and you're thinking about it and it's very conscious. And then at some point you're just driving. And from that point on, you don't really get any better at it. But it's still possible if you wanted to get much better at it. There's professional drivers, there's people who can type really fast competitively. And that's the same in any field, in any skill that you're learning and anything like that. And the difference is that the people who continue learning and continue getting better stay in that second stage of associative learning. And the point at which you arbitrarily relegate yourself to good enough and just start automating that skill is called the hypothesis of par or tolerance. So that's the point at which you decided, like, I'm done learning how to type and now I'm just typing. I'm done learning how to drive and now I'm just driving. And people do that in their occupations as well. They have, at some point, their hypothesis of par kicks in and now they're just doing their job as a doctor, as a lawyer, as an entrepreneur, as whatever. At some point, they're no longer learning how to do that thing better. And that varies based on the specifics of the occupation, based primarily on feedback loops, like John was talking about earlier. Surgeons, for example, tend to get better over time because they always have a feedback loop. If they screw up, they immediately know it because the patient's bleeding, the patient's dying, like something very obvious and bad happens. Where someone like an X-ray tech may not have that feedback loop. Like if they miss a cancer diagnosis, they have no way of knowing that. It's the same there's another field that I work in with like interrogation stuff. A lot of people who do detecting deception kind of work or interrogation kind of work, if they're wrong, they don't know it. They're going to tell themselves that they're right. And so what we found in some of the other research I've done with some government people is that there are a lot of interrogators who are really bad at their jobs, who are right at a probability lower than chance, like who are right like 30% of the time, where they've developed a lot of pet theories about what works. They have what they call their gut instincts, but those gut instincts have never been checked against reality. So they've just gone awry, to the point that in a lot of cases, if they just did the opposite of what they thought was the right decision, they'd be really good. But they have these
they'd
theories
be right 70% of the time.
work.
Yeah.
And there's research in this in all kinds of fields. And the medical industry is a terrifying one. The airline industry is a good example in the other sense, in the way the airline industry treats disasters or accidents, where they have the black boxes. And anytime something bad happens, there's an investigation and a report and public data. And they try to find out what went wrong, what caused it, and what they can do in the future to prevent it. Where in other industries, if you see, especially things that seem well-meaning, like we have a zero accident culture, we have zero accidents, we have zero mistakes, we don't tolerate errors. We've had 30 days of no mistakes or no injuries on the job, things like that. What it often does is suppress the reporting of incidents, so that incidents go in family or in-house. Like if you're in your particular team and you screwed something up, you hide it. People on your team know about it, but it doesn't need to get reported anywhere else. No one else knows about it. That was one of the factors leading up to the explosion of the space shuttle Columbia, was that the foam shedding that was happening on the space shuttle that eventually caused it to explode on takeoff had gone from a major issue that they dealt with to an in-family issue that they just kind of decided was okay.
Oh, wow.
Because they didn't want to report it. And so with the hypothesis of par stuff, it comes down to like dealing with negative feedback or dealing with stress, dealing with criticism. There's, on like the human psych side, a thing called your stress mindset, which is whether you think of stress as being an enhancing, necessary thing that's like a tool that you have for getting through a difficult situation, or if you think of stress as debilitating. And in a lot of popular culture stuff, we think of stress as something you should have less of. You should just not be stressed. Where in reality, stress is a performance enhancer. Like people who do well academically, in physical performances, in their ability to emotionally regulate or learn from emotionally challenging situations, they're all doing that with a stress response. So it's not that stress is good or bad, it's just the quality of it and how you use it. And one of the things that determines whether someone sees stress as debilitating or as enhancing is their willingness to face feedback. And if you ask someone if they've done these studies on like public speaking, and they ask people like, do you want to get feedback and criticism about what your speaking was like when this is over? The more likely they are to see stress as just a debilitating thing that they should avoid, the more likely they are to not want to hear any feedback, because they see the difficulty of facing that feedback as being just a useless harm to them. Whereas someone who sees stress as a productive tool for improving and getting better will want that feedback, and they'll want to use that stressful criticism to make themselves better in the future. And that changes their downstream stress response and their ability to learn and adapt over time. And in workplace stuff, in an office setting, that primarily changes whether someone uses active versus passive coping. Meaning, do they solve problems, or do they make problems go away by solving them, or do they make problems go away by avoiding or ignoring them? And again, if someone's leans towards that side of seeing stress as debilitating, they're more likely to also use passive coping mechanisms and make problems go away by ignoring them, which, when you look at workplace performance, is not a useful thing. It's not helpful at all.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got to create a culture, obviously, and reward the culture. So, absolutely our team as well, too, in terms of how they now...
All of that. I was just, as you were talking, there's just so much there that is so relevant. And I think, it also comes down to just people, like, they don't want to be confronted with that, right? And it's that confrontation of, fight
or flight.
I suppose I'm a good example of, I'm not, but like I've been in my role for a really long time, right? And I can almost remember the time where I thought to myself, like, I need to change the way, like, I take on feedback and how I utilize that feedback, because you can get so easily stuck in that defensive mindset that you spoke about, Jonathan, where people just, they get defense, they get that, and they change the way that their posture and everything when that happens. And I remember that time, and I always get asked, like, are you gonna start looking for a job elsewhere because you've been with ATP for so long? And now my thing is just like, when I stop learning, or when I stop growing, or when I get to that point where I can feel myself like slacking off, or like, sliding backwards a little bit, like that's the point where I'll think, it might be time to switch it up. But I just try and always challenge myself, and always, it's very interesting.
It is. And look, you've got one life to live, and you want to obviously be feeling like whatever you're doing, that you're getting some value out of it. It's not just obviously about money, but it's also about your life and about, how much joy and what you can determine out of it. But in terms of feedback, it's really funny because my wife and I are in our 40s now, and Tony started doing a thing called Fit Stop, right? Which is like an F45
it's
sort
like
of
group
thing.
Yeah, I think you've got F45 in America now, but it's like group sessions.
And
high intensity.
Tony's an A-type personality, and she also suffered from chronic fatigue when she was younger. She had what's the kissing disease called? Glandular fever, which, and a lot of time people with A-type personalities and just keep pushing themselves as well too, don't listen to that feedback. So she's got to watch, right? And it sort of tells her how hard she trained, and she finished training on Wednesday, because I see it all the time, and she's like going to these classes like 6 days a week at the moment, I think 5 days, and I'm like, babe, you're going to burn out, because she did it with CrossFit and she got super fit, and then she just crashed. It's actually where I learned to play poker, because she got chronic fatigue. And so we'd come home in an evening, we didn't have kids at this point, and literally she was crashing at 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, and then not waking up until 7, 8 o'clock the next morning, right? So I'd be like, well, what the heck am I going to do? So I actually took myself into the casino and became a really good poker player, which was kind of a handy skill. But anyway, she's got this watch, which is sort of giving her feedback, and I'm like, you've got to back it off. You seriously, Tone, you've got to make sure that you get some feedback here. Literally, the watch told her, right, you need to rest now for the next 62 hours after the last class that you had, right? It's funny, I tease her. I said, you're not one of these sexy rabbits anymore. You're a little bit older. You're an arduous turtle. Now, she wears that as a badge, right? I'm actually getting T-shirts made up. And she goes, yeah, but it's the turtle that actually wins in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that feedback, I think understanding that you can do what you need to, but you've got to have that feedback. You've got to have that ability to assess. You can't just get stuck into just blatting it out all the time without any sort of that feedback. And this seems to be the point that we're talking about, is obviously getting that feedback, having that level of humility, having a trusted circle, having people that can actually talk into your life. And again, even in terms of listening to other people, if you're, don't go in with a preconceived, like this is going to be bad, right? And I think this is the thing that I'm hearing a little bit, but I probably can't articulate it quite as well, is that feedback is really, really important. I mean, if I look at the younger people today, they talk about stress and they talk about, what's difficult. It's about having nobody like their social media post, right? And I know that this is kind of a bit funny, and I read something about TikTok, how people are creating images and a persona on TikTok, and it's actually they're stressing themselves out because they're saying it's not actually me. So I've created this, they've almost built a prison for themselves, right? I mean, you think back 100 years ago when we were charging machine gun nests, right? That's what a 17, 18-year-old was looking at. And now it's like, I need to have time out because somebody said something horrible about me on social media, right? I mean, like there's this real disconnect that's happening. And I know that for us that are a little bit older, that have lived life a little bit, there's that wisdom that comes from life where you sort of like starts, Oscar Wilde said that youth is wasted on the youngest. So is, but how do you say that as well too, that people have got a disproportionate to stress? How do you help them to actually see that stress is a good thing in moderation? I mean, obviously, and how you deal with that.
Yeah. So,
go ahead, John.
Yeah. The first thing there is your stress response changes based on your perception of what's happening. So, and your perception is your opinion. So it's your interpretation of what is occurring. So if you perceive that whatever like you said, the Twitter post is threatening to you, then you're going to have a much different hormonal response within your own body, and what happens in your bloodstream happens in your mind. So if you see that as very threatening, you think that's going to be overwhelming to you, and that's your initial response, you're going to have way more cortisol release. That's going to change the way your brain functions. You're going to learn that you have this threat-based response, and it's going to be, again, kind of go along with a bunch of emotional cascade of things that happens in your brain. On the flip side of that, if you see difficulties as something that's just challenging for you and not a bad thing, then it completely changes your hormonal response. And you'll still have a stress response, but it's adequate to help you deal with that situation and to overcome it, whether it's a physical thing, whether you need to just have the resources. So right now, like we're in the middle of a podcast, right? Before coming onto this, I get a little bit nervous before these things, but instead of perceiving that as a threatening thing, I tell myself, I'm getting ready to do this thing. I'm about to perform. I can get really focused or review my notes, and I feel like I'm in a really good mindset going into it. So I see that stress response as, in this podcast, as a challenge for me, something that I know I can deal with. I know that I have the expertise to come onto that thing and to perform well. And my stress response is something friendly for me. So my opinion of what's about to happen helps me manage my overall stress response and modulate it to be right in that sweet spot where you can perform really well. And this kind of gets back to the thing where you keep bringing up with burnout, is that stress is your friend, but you have to have cycles of being on and off. And we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of most people. I mean, everybody's filling up their 24 hours each day. So telling people to just do more isn't generally helpful. It's how do you figure out how to get more out of the time that you're already spending on all the things you're doing? And obviously you can be a little bit more, diligent with how you're spending your time. And that is definitely one of the things we focus on with people. But with a lot of it, it's more just about how do you be more focused when you're recovering, when you're spending time with your family, when you're working, you're actually working, you're fully engaged, you're focused on the task at hand. And so this stress response is a big part of it. So if I see myself going into work, I'm a little bit anxious about a meeting that's coming up, but I perceive that as something that's really good. It's a challenge that I can overcome. Then I'm going to go into that, feel really good. I can do that work. And then again, over time, the idea here is you have these periods of training. Like, do you get more fit when you're training all the time? If you're training 6 days a week? No, like you're not getting more fit from session to session. Your body's adapting over much longer time scales. So from over a daily cycle, I have to sleep my 8 hours and I can be focused for a certain amount of the day. A certain amount of the day, I need unfocused time to let my brain wander, to help me learn, consolidate, consolidate all the information that I had throughout that day and become more effective. So, and then on a week to week, over the course of a week, you need to have time when you're really, really focused. You need to have time when you're less focused, when you have more social time. Over a month, you need to have time when you're really, you might be training hard for 2 or 3 weeks and you back off. And if you pay attention to those cycles over time, there's some individual differences from person to person on exactly what that is, but we know what works really well for people. This is why I tell people to sleep 8 hours a night. And if you get 8 hours of quality restful sleep, guess what? We know you're going to perform a lot better. You're going to learn a lot more quickly. You're going to be much more resilient, much more capable. And so it's not this thing about how do I do more? It's how do I get more out of every moment that I'm doing it? The same is true with training. You can get actually better results from your training by doing less, right? So if I'm more focused in my training and I have, say, an introductory week, and then I push it really hard for a couple of weeks and I back off and let my body adapt, my total training stimulus might be less than if I just crush it for 4 weeks straight, but my outcome or my adaptation is actually much better. So again, it's about focusing on how do you get the most out of all the things you're doing and you're optimizing it. And a big part of that is, being able to control your attention and manage your stress response. And that's okay. Stress is not a bad thing, but it's also not your friend 24 hours a day. So you need to have a time when you are being challenged, and you need to have times when you're recovering and letting your mind and your body recover. And if you balance those systems out over periods of time, that's when you're going to get these optimal results. You're learning, you're improving your skills, you're getting more physically fit, all the above. And you can have periods where they're out of whack. The body's like unbelievably good at dealing with exceptionally high periods of stress, whether that's physically, emotionally, psychologically. What the body's really not good at is low level constant stress. And that's kind of the thing you were calling out, is that I see everything as a threat, right? Everything is beating me up and everything is against me. And I see stress as a bad thing. And that just amplifies this kind of low grade stress response all the time. You don't feel good. You can't recover. When you're spending time with your friends and family, you're not actually present. When you're at work, you're thinking about spending all the time you're not spending with your friends and family. And those are the cycles you want to pull people out of and get them to be more fully engaged in their moment. And again, a lot of this comes back to how you think about or your opinion about challenges and difficulties in your life.
So you brought up that quote of youth is wasted on the young, and it's a useful point. And it also sort of backs up to physiological reality or the neuroscience of how brains develop. And that, say someone in their 30s or 40s or older, they go through something, any kind of experience, and they have the ability to put it into context and decide where it lives on the big deal chart and how much of a stress response it really needs. But you have to ask, how you know that, how you know what you know in order to do that. And the answer is that you've lived something, you've experienced something that level set that experience for you previously. And the greater the range of past experiences you've had, then the wider your vocabulary is, and the better your ability to select and put into context a given stress response. And when we, what John was talking about with this threat and challenge stuff, that's a neurochemically unique or distinct stress response. When we perceive a threat, there's cortisol and adrenaline, and the response is fairly long-lived. It kind of vaguely lives in the background for quite a while, where that challenge response is more selective. It's primarily norepinephrine, and it drops away quickly, and it only lifts up to the level of the stressor that's necessary, to the physiological demand necessary to meet the challenge. when we do that, when we face a challenge, say it's your Twitter post, or it's you just got cut off in traffic, or you just got some terrible, like you just looked at your P&L or something and you just see that the numbers are really bad. There's a rapid two-step response that happens subconsciously in your brain. And it's basically, do I know what this is? And do I have what it takes to handle it? Your ability to answer both of those questions is based on the experiences that you've had previously, on the vocabulary that you've built through living. And that vocabulary, like what you're learning is a sense of predictability and control. So in any given situation, you're learning to identify what it is and what's coming next, and the extent of your personal abilities to cope with that situation. And you can't know those things until you've earned them, until you've suffered through something difficult, until you've been through those really bad news things, until you've been cut off in traffic like 15 times and realized that you still got to work anyway, like until you've had those experiences. And with kids, like adolescents in particular, like as their brains are developing, with adults, we'll start with them. When we experience something like that, like we get a cut off in traffic, we get the terrible profit and loss report for the month, or the numbers are bad or whatever, some stressor happens, there's an initial response in the limbic system of the brain where like we light up with fear or threat or whatever. And then there's a rapid neocortical response in like the thinky part of our brain that level sets it and calms it back down, puts it into context. With adolescents and people in their early 20s, that's not happening yet, not to the full extent. And that's why kids swing so fast from 1 to 10, because their brain is still learning what goes on the big deal chart. And it kind of maxes everything out until they have collected like a vocabulary, a list of experiences that allows them to say like, oh, I've been through this before and that was only a 7, so I can moderate this response. But when you look at kids or adolescents, when they have that initial threat response, it's not modulated or moderated by their neocortex. Like it just runs and it goes. And the only way for them to learn to regulate that is to go through experiences where they hit bottom, where they struggle, where they experience stress, and where they learn to cope experientially. And the important thing developmentally for people, for employees, for special operators, for whoever, is you can speed that process along. Like you can turn that into a form of practice, and you can expose yourself to specific stressors with specific coping mechanisms or means of dealing with them in a way that uses that rapid learning model, that skill acquisition process, so that we don't just use the hypothesis of par thing and tell ourselves that we're really good enough at dealing with being cut off in traffic or getting bad news or getting bad feedback. And we can specifically like improve our ability to level set these things and moderate our stress response and function in those difficult moments. Because if you look at an average 50-year-old, they haven't had the same 50 years of experiences that make them calm and collected and rational in difficult moments. Like some people have had a lot of experiences, some people have had not very many, and some people have not learned during those experiences. They just arbitrarily did whatever came to mind and ran with it. And you can see that, as people go along. Like you see the guys who are really calm, you see the women that are not, or that are as well. And it's manageable. It's a controllable, knowable process. And as we train special ops guys, as we work with companies, that's one of the main things that we do. We identify the stressful experiences that people are going to encounter in their jobs, and we put them in those experiences, but in a controlled way that allows them to earn their success, in a way that allows them to level set those experiences and modulate their stress response.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? It's sort of a little bit like that movie, The Princess Bride, where the guy puts the poison in both cups. You know what I mean? Because he's built up a bit of tolerance about it. And this is the problem. I think a lot of people run from uncomfortable situations. I don't like that. So as you say, I'm going to ignore it, or I'm not going to deal with it. I'm going to like palm it off and let somebody else deal with it. But if you live a life like that, where you're constantly in fear, sometimes you've got to embrace it. And you've also got to look at it, I guess, and say, so what? You know what I mean? So somebody cuts you off in traffic, and this is a big one for me. It used to piss me off because it was a bit like, how dare this person be cutting me off? It's like, and if you really think about it, like, so someone pulls in, and how much longer is it going to take you to get to where you're going if you're letting these people cut in? You're going to be a hell of a lot less stressed. You're going to be in a lot better shape when you get there. And it's probably going to make the difference of, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. I mean, is it really worth having all that angst? I mean, and again, I appreciate some stresses are larger, but it's the small foxes, it's the little stresses that people give so much weight and bearing to that rob them of so much joy. Anyway, I'm sure we're sort of on the same page there. But yeah, avoiding stress is kind of crazy. You've got to, get that experience to help build that resilience and then put it into context. And actually, going through some really, really, really difficult stuff. When my wife and I were younger, we lost our baby at birth, and it was a really terrible time. And I remember talking to the doctor, and he was very calm, and he said, "Look, I'm really sorry, guys," but he says, "You know what?" And he said something really strange that a lot of people wouldn't be able to take, but he said, "Embrace this." And he said, because if you can't avoid the situation, if you lean into it, it will actually help you to process and to get through it. And it was one of the best. And honestly, and I heard him, which is amazing as well too. And how's that coming from a GP? It was absolutely fantastic, right? So, with anything in life, you're always going to face trouble. And it's your ability to be able to process and to move through it. Whether it's the death of a loved one, or whether it's the loss of a business, or whether it's something horrible, you can go through it, and you can learn to get through the other side. But embracing the process, as opposed to trying to not acknowledge it, trying to not deal with it, you're going to be constantly stuck in that moment, and you're never going to be able to grow. So yeah, it's interesting.
There's this, I've just been picking apart research on this thing called Paradoxical Intent, which they use. It was kind of a Viktor Frankl thing, or he was a big proponent of it, but they use it as sort of a form of therapy for helping people deal with uncomfortable things. So like if someone blushes badly while public speaking or in social situations, and they don't want to blush, they tell them to do the opposite and go put yourself in an uncomfortable social situation and try to blush as hard as you possibly can until like your face is glowing so red that people have to look away. They tell them to just like lean into it and do the opposite. Or like if you're public speaking and you're afraid of how high your heart rate gets, to go do some public speaking and try to actively raise your heart rate as high as you possibly can, and just try to do it. Like try to make it as bad as it gets. And I was looking into that because I've been trying to communicate this concept of, there's this moment that happens a lot in the special ops selections where your brain will tell you that if you push any harder, if you keep going, you're just going to die, or you're going to black out or break, or something terrible is going to happen. Like the lights are going to go out. And most of the people who are successful just say like, well, let's find out where the pot of gold is at the end of that rainbow. And they try to do that. And they try to push so hard that they actually black out, or like, well, I'll just die. Like medics are good at this, and they'll figure it out. And what you learn is that when you push really hard into that thing, into the bad part of trying to run so fast that you just black yourself out or whatever, is that you can't, or it's super duper hard and it mostly just hurts the whole time, and then you keep going and you're okay. And I think my wife and I had the same experience with birth in February, and yeah, it's absolutely terrible. And I think there's absolutely something to that, in sort of like making the monsters come out into the light and leaning into the awfulness of it, like letting yourself hurt as much as you possibly can, like just rolling around in it, like letting it be terrible, because that's what it's meant to be. And once you lose that aversion to it, like once you're okay with it being a terrible, terrible experience and being sad and whatever, then there's nothing else that life can really take from you. Like you're already there. You're already good with it. Like you're just letting it wash over you. And there's something really valuable in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Absolutely. Elsa, what else do we want to go through with the guys?
I feel like we've
covered a lot.
Had a really, really good episode.
So, guys, I love this. I think the ability to be able to adapt and the direction that you're going at the moment obviously is going to be working with businesses and taking a lot of this mindset to help, individuals, high performance. Who else are you working with? Where else can people go to learn about what you're doing? What is it that you're really passionate about right now that you want to do and want to help and want to work with people with? So
I'd say as a general thing, what we do is help people perform well under stress in difficult environments. We help high performers in most any setting. Specifically, we do that through the special operations world, and guys from, actually men and women from all over the world. We have a couple of Australians as well going through programs. And everything that we do lives on buildingtheelite.com, or we have an Instagram that's pretty active. It's, I think, just at Building the Elite. And you can find us there.
Yeah, and I think just to mention as well too that your success rate for people that we're trying to get into elite programs is at 90%. Is that right? Like, so, and the failure rate is typically. Do you want to just quickly talk about that, Greg?
Failure rate is typically the failure rate is, depending on the program, anywhere from 60 to 90%, depending on how you count the numbers. Wow. Where in our case, it's a pretty high touch process the way we coach, but it's unusual for our clients to not make it. And for the past now 11 years, our success rate's been around 90%.
Wow,
amazing.
So. Got to say that's a massive. So obviously that's a lot of mindset and a lot of coaching how to deal with stress.
Yeah, it is.
Yep. And anything else, Jonathan? Like, in terms of, who do you want to be working with? How do you want to help people?
That's a good question. I mean, Craig and I started this, or at least I know I did, just to help anybody who was not trying to avoid difficulty, but to just work through those problems more efficiently. And so I think that's always been our path forward. So whether it's been special operations guys or at our facility in Denver, working with more Gen Pop, or business leaders or anyone in between, it doesn't really matter. Like, I just find more the personalities, the interesting people to work with. And so basically anybody who's really looking to improve themselves, I think all the stuff that we talk about are widely applicable. I mean, that's why we start off with some of the more fundamental concepts of just understanding complex systems and chaos theory and how that applies to the world that we live in, because it's all the world that we live in. So regardless of what you're doing, the better you can understand those principles and understand the way your mind works, the context is somewhat irrelevant because those principles will work with everybody, regardless of the specific goal that they're pursuing.
Wow, that's great.
I have one last question.
Okay.
It's one that we've started asking all of our guests. And it is simply, what's one question that you wished you got asked more? Now, I've put you on the spot because we didn't tell you about this earlier, but just have a think for a moment. And if there's anything that you wish that you did get asked more.
I don't know. You guys have been really thorough, like in the directions you've gone. As far as other questions, I think some of what we covered on this call.
Emergency, evacuate now. For me, I was just talking to John about this. I don't know if you caught me stumble where I'm working on changing the way I use like pronouns basically. And like the normal vernacular is team guys, boat guys, ODA guys, special forces guys. But the reality is that there are women in special operations and in a lot of the military units, either in support roles or in the high level, like sneaky squirrel units, like in active operator roles, like the ones that you just never hear about.
Right.
And so I've been working on like being more general and saying people instead of, like special forces guys. And I dropped that phrase in there somewhere in our interview when we were talking, and I screwed it all up because I tried to throw women in there as well, and it sounded like an idiot. But the question that I think would be useful, like that would be good for people to know more of is that there are female special operators, especially in the clandestine communities, doing like really legit work. And like the idea that women are like physically incapable of a lot of the things that special ops people do is just not really true. I mean, they're outliers to some extent, but we've got a client right now who maxes out all the physical standards for men in the U.S. Marine Corps.
Wow.
And she's little. She's like 5'3".
Wow.
She's just really strong.
Really strong.
And yeah, I think that's especially in the field that we work in.
a useful thing for people to know about.
Jonathan, what was?
Yes,
did
Jonathan.
you have something? Sorry, we got to say, is there something that you wish that people asked you more, or that you wish more people knew? That something that you see was really valid.
Yeah, I think the question which more people ask is what book should I read after listening to this conversation? Because one of the things that Craig and I talk a lot about is that you can get a lot of insights from something like a podcast, but it should just be the starting point. It shouldn't be the end point of learning. So it should introduce you to a new topic or a new way of thinking about something, but that should just be the entry point into them learning a lot more about that thing. Because otherwise you're getting pieces of information without context and all the other information that really surrounds that. And there's just no way Craig or I or anyone can do justice to a really broad topic, in an hour. And so again, that's the strength of a podcast, is it allows people to get a lot of different pieces of information and get those things, and then they can dive in later. So I guess what book would be the follow-up to this conversation? And my answer to that is the book Thinking in Systems. We talked a lot about complexity and chaos theory and systems and how they evolve over time. And if you understand or have at least a basic fundamental understanding of the principles that govern every complex system, which encompasses every field of study that we've talked about, whether it's psychology, physiology, we're talking about sociology and politics and all these things, then it gives you a much deeper understanding of how all those pieces work together and how limited your scope of knowledge really is, which again gives you that humility to understand that you don't have all the answers to everything, and that at best you can have like a partial understanding of things. But that also gives you a lot more power to go out and seek out the answers and not think that you know something when you really don't even have any understanding. Instead, you can acknowledge the things that you don't know and then seek out that information when you don't have a solution that's not working for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think knowledge is empowerment, and absolutely. And I think today as well too, where people see such massive issues or massive problems, things that they see as insurmountable. One of my favorite sayings is, use what you've got in your hand, and influence your family and your community around you, for positive outcomes. Because I think sometimes you can become overwhelmed with the size of the problem. It's like eating an elephant, right? But don't let that cause inaction. Whether you're really overweight and you're trying to lose weight, whether you're really unfit, whether you want to become a Marine and you're timid, or if you want to get into special forces, if you're in business as well too, or you want to get into business, it's one step in front of the other. You don't have to be at the end goal immediately, but just making the start. And that's part of why we do this podcast. We want to inspire people. We want to educate people. We want people to not accept everything, as being the status quo. You can change it. You ultimately are responsible for your life, and you have the same 24 hours as everybody else. And if you utilize that effectively, you can create not only the life for yourself that you want, but for your loved ones and for your friends and family and all your community. But look, guys, I love, this has been so great. Brooklyn is one of our producers, and she's loving this podcast. She's got, oh my gosh, she's got so many snippets. We're out there singing the snippet good, sort of. But there is really some great information, some great gold. So
yeah, I'm going to go and read the book for sure. We've got
Building
it here.
the Elite. Yeah, do you want to just, So you guys obviously co-authored that book. There's some gold in there, and some further clarity and some more depth into what we've been talking about today. Obviously hit the guys up on their website and their social media sites as well too.
Buildingtheelite.com.
Yeah. Is there anything else, Craig, Jonathan, that you want to sort of leave our listeners with today? We covered everything?
No, yeah. For me, that pretty much covers it.
Great. Look, guys,
thank you so much.
This has been excellent.
Yeah.
It's been a real privilege talking to both of you. We wish you every success going forward. And we know that, from your experiences and your applied knowledge, that you're going to be able to help a lot of people out there as well too. So if you really are interested in overcoming those obstacles, and you're sick and tired of butting up against that glass ceiling or whatever it is, look the guys up and reach out to them. And obviously, Craig, you said that you're working with people in Australia, but you're working with people around the world. So it doesn't matter where you are. These guys can reach out to you and can get some support in some way or shape.
Yeah. Yeah, they can email us through the site. The contact email is team@buildingtheelite. And they can find that just by going to the website as well. And yeah, we work with people from all over.
Brilliant.
Amazing. Thanks so much for your time today, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Great chatting.
Thanks, guys.
All right, take care.
I guess.